Number 10, the Tunica Molesta, the painful tunic of Rome. In the smoldering aftermath of the Great Fire of 64 AD, Emperor Nero stands in his palace listening to a city that hates him. Rumors are already loose in the streets. People are whispering that the fire began on his orders, that he wanted to clear the crowded slums to build a new golden palace for himself, that he stood on a tower with a lyre in his hands and sang about the fall of Troy while ordinary Romans burned to death in their homes. Nero needs those rumors to stop. He needs a target for the mob's grief, and he finds one in a small, unpopular religious sect from the eastern provinces, Christians. The historian Tacitus, writing decades later, describes what happens next in a single blistering paragraph in Book 15 of his Annals. Some Christians are sewn into the skins of wild animals and torn apart by hunting dogs in the arena. Others are nailed to crosses. And a third group, the group history has never forgotten, is dressed in a garment that Roman law calls the Tunica Molesta, the painful tunic. It is a long, coarse shirt, soaked in pitch, resin, oil, or naphtha. Every fiber of it is engineered to burn. The condemned are marched into Nero's private gardens on the Vatican Hill after sunset, tied to tall wooden posts driven into the ground at regular intervals along the paths, and set alight. Their bodies become lamps. Nero throws open his gardens for a public spectacle. He hosts a chariot show in the circus that runs through the same grounds and mingles with his guests dressed as a charioteer. In the flickering orange light of dying human beings, he takes his laps. The Tunica Molesta was not invented for the Christians. Roman law had used it for at least a century before Nero to punish arsonists on the principle that a man who burned property should himself be burned. Slaves, deserters, magicians, and traitors from the humiliores, the lower classes, were the usual recipients. What Nero adds is theater. He takes an existing punishment and turns it into stagecraft. He turns bodies into architecture. He turns screams into the soundtrack of a garden party. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that keeps this execution at number 10 rather than lower on the list, is what Tacitus records happens to the crowd. Tacitus is no friend of the Christians. He calls them a superstition. He believes they deserve punishment for something. And yet he writes that as the fires burned in Nero's garden, a feeling of compassion began to rise in the watching Romans. Not because the Christians were innocent, in Tacitus's view, but because it became obvious that the executions were not being carried out for the public good. They were being carried out to satisfy the cruelty of one man. The crowd's hatred, which Nero had tried so carefully to redirect, began to swing back toward the emperor himself. The Tunica Molesta accidentally did the opposite of what it was designed to do. It created sympathy for the victims. It marked the beginning of the moral rehabilitation of the Christian movement in Rome, a movement that within 3 centuries would rule the empire that once used them as candles. The Christian writer Tertullian, more than a century later, sneers that his people are mocked as Sarmanticii and Symaxii, the faggot fellows and half-axle men, because they were tied to half-axle posts with bundles of dry sticks piled around them and burned. He wears the insult like a badge. Nero himself will not live to enjoy his garden lanterns for long. Within 4 years, he will be dead, dragged down by his own senate, forced to stab himself in the throat while whispering, "What an artist dies in me." But the Tunica Molesta will outlive him by centuries. It will still be in the Roman legal codes under the Emperor Justinian, the first in the 500s AD, prescribed for heretics. The first entry on our list is the execution method, where cruelty backfired so completely that the victims won the moral war 300 years after the last one of them stopped screaming. Number 9. Execution by elephant. Somewhere along a dusty road in the Mauryan Empire, around the 3rd century BC, a condemned prisoner is dragged into a stone-paved courtyard. He does not know how he is going to die. Around him, a crowd gathers in silence. A pillar has been sunk into the ground, and beside it stands the largest land animal on Earth, an Asian bull elephant. 6 tons of muscle, ivory, and calm intelligence, its skin marked with painted patterns. On its neck sits a man called the Mahout, holding a short metal hook called an ankusha. The Mahout is not the judge, he is the judge's finger. The condemned man is forced to kneel and place his head upon the stone at the base of the pillar. The elephant lowers its trunk, curls it around him almost gently, and then waits. The mahout speaks a single Sanskrit word, slow, and the elephant, obedient as any hunting dog, lifts its enormous foot and places it one deliberate press at a time upon the man's right leg. There is a snap of bone that carries all the way to the back of the crowd, then the left leg, then the right arm, then the left arm. Only when the mahout speaks the second word, finish, does the elephant lift a foot above the man's skull and end him. In neighboring Sri Lanka, elephants were fitted with long, sharpened blades attached to the tips of their tusks so they could rip a prisoner in half before the crushing began. In the kingdom of Siam, the modern Thailand elephants were trained to toss condemned men into the air and catch them on their tusks before pinning them to the ground. In Cochin China, the southern part of what is now Vietnam, a British envoy called John Crawford would later write in 1820, one of watching a criminal tied to a stake while an elephant simply charged and pulped him against the wood. Execution by elephant was so widely used across South and Southeast Asia that it earned its own Sanskrit name, Gajadanda, punishment of the elephant, and its own Hindi name, Gunga Rao. The 4th century BC political treatise called the Arthashastra, written by the Mauryan advisor Kautilya, explicitly recommends the use of trained execution elephants as a display of royal power. The Manu Smriti, the Hindu laws of Manu, prescribes it for a whole catalog of offenses from tax evasion to rebellion. It was still being used in the 1800s when British officers of the East India Company recorded their disgust at witnessing it. But what elevates this method into the ancient world's top 10 is something the executioners themselves discovered by accident. Elephants are intelligent. They are trainable. And they are also, as any modern zoologist will confirm, capable of something that looks a lot like reluctance. There are eyewitness accounts, especially in accounts collected in the 1800s, but describing traditions much older, in which elephants hesitated before delivering the killing blow, in which they had to be prodded again by the mahout, in which one elephant, having been ordered to torture a man, slowly appeared to grow distressed and instead crushed the victim quickly against orders. Mahouts sometimes had to retire animals from execution duty because the elephants began to refuse. Even the animal, the tool of the state, could develop something like a conscience. Rome and Carthage both borrowed the method, mostly for use on mutinous soldiers. Carthage, in particular, seems to have used it as a spectacular way of dealing with unreliable mercenaries after the mercenary war in the 3rd century BC. In the ancient world, elephants were not just an execution method, they were a message. They said, look upon this animal, look at its size, look at what the king can command it to do. If the king can bend nature itself to his will, what chance do you have against him? The mahout retired one animal after another, but the pillars in the courtyard remained. And every convict who was dragged there knew that the last thing he would hear was not a human voice, but the low huffing breath of a creature that could snap him like a stick of celery, and was politely waiting for permission. Number 8, Apotympanismos, the plank of Athens. The word democracy comes from the Greek city of Athens. So does the word philosophy. So does the word jury. The idea that ordinary citizens should decide the fate of ordinary citizens rather than kings comes from that same rocky peninsula in the 5th century BC. And yet, in the same city that produced Socrates and Plato, in the same century that gave us the birth of theater and the birth of the philosophical dialogue, there was a form of state execution called Apotympanismos, which translates loosely as death upon the plank. Here is how it worked. In 1915, a Greek archaeologist called Evstathios Pellikides was excavating an ancient cemetery in the district of Phaleron, the old port of Athens. In one of the mass graves, he uncovered the skeletons of 17 or 18 men, all buried without offerings, all dumped together as if hastily shoveled into the earth. Around the neck, wrists, and ankles of each skeleton, there were iron collars, and still attached to those iron collars, in flakes and fragments, preserved for 25 centuries, were the remains of wooden boards. What Pellikides had discovered was the physical evidence of a punishment mentioned only in scattered fragments of Athenian legal texts. The condemned man was stripped naked, marched to a hilltop or a crossroads outside the city, and there clamped by an iron ring at the neck, another at each wrist, and another at each ankle onto a tall, wide wooden plank set upright in the ground. And then the executioners walked away. That was it. There was no killing blow, there was no beheading, no throat cut. The man remained pinned there, upright, exposed to the sun, the rain, the cold of the night, the flies, and eventually the birds and dogs. He died of thirst, exposure, sunstroke, or sepsis, sometimes over 2 days, sometimes over 5. And crucially, he was left visible deliberately staged where every traveler passing by could see him. His enemies were free to come and mock him. His friends were forbidden to bring food or water on pain of joining him. Now, this was the same democratic Athens that had invented the jury system. This was the same city that gave the philosopher Socrates the aristocratic privilege of dying by drinking hemlock, quickly, painlessly, in the company of his friends, in a warm room. Hemlock cost 12 drachmas, a professional's wage, and it was reserved for citizens who had money and family standing. For everyone else, for slaves, foreigners, thieves, runaway soldiers, and rebels against the state, there was the plank. Democratic Athens ran a 2-tier system of execution, and the plank was the tier they were not proud of. In the Greek historians and orators, Apotympanismos appears in glancing references. In one speech preserved from the 4th century BC, a client of the orator Lysias mentions that his brother was executed this way after being caught signaling to the enemy with fire during the Sicilian expedition. In another, a common thief called Menestratus, who had turned informer under the tyrannical regime of the 30, was executed the same way when democracy was restored. Effectively, this was crucifixion without the nails. And here is the wicked cleverness of it. The Athenian state never had to touch the condemned man again after he was clamped in place. It never had to spill blood. The state simply pointed at him and let time and thirst do the work. Modern archaeologists studying the Phaleron skeletons have suggested that some of the victims may have been beaten first before being clamped to the board, but the primary cause of death was slow exposure. Even hardened Greek writers found the sight distressing. The satirist Aristophanes uses death on the plank as a comic threat in his plays, evidence that even in casual conversation, Athenians recognized it as the worst way to go. The rocks around Athens are dotted with the ghosts of those planks. Every time a traveler descended from the city gates toward the coast, every time a farmer walked to the market, every time a philosopher strolled outside the walls, to think there was a chance he would pass a naked man locked to a board, dying of thirst against a hillside, being pecked at by crows. The city that invented the vote also invented the plank, and the plank ran for centuries alongside the vote. Quietly, embarrassingly, undeniably, the Athenians never wrote long philosophical treatises about Apotympanismos, the way they wrote long philosophical treatises about hemlock. Some things a civilization prefers to leave undocumented, but the skeletons at Phaleron with the iron collars still around their bones do the documentation for them. Number 7. Lysi and the 5 Pains of Qin. In 208 BC, in the capital city of Shenyang, the greatest lawgiver in Chinese history is dragged into a public marketplace to be executed under his own legal code. His name is Lysi III, actually simply Lysi the Chancellor, of the Qin dynasty. He was 72 years old, and just 2 decades earlier, he had been the most powerful non-royal in the largest empire the earth had ever seen. Lysi is one of those historical figures whose brilliance and cruelty were so intertwined that they cannot be separated. As chancellor to the first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huang Lysi helped standardize the written script that 1 billion Chinese people still use today. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized the axle widths of carts so that a single set of wheel ruts would carry trade across the whole empire. He was also the man behind one of the most infamous acts of cultural destruction in history, the burning of the books, in which almost every Confucian text, historical record, and philosophical work that did not agree with Qin legalism was collected and thrown into fires across the empire. Scholars who complained were reportedly buried alive in pits. And he was the architect of the Qin legal system. The Qin legal system was not just harsh, it was calibrated under a code that borrowed heavily from an older reformer called Shangyang punishments, were graded like the strokes of a paintbrush. There was tattooing for petty theft, the branding of the forehead so that the offender could never wash off his crime. There was nose slicing. There was foot amputation in which one or both feet were sawn off. There was castration, applied both to men and, in a modified form, to women. And at the top of the ladder was death by waist cutting, in which the condemned was placed on a block and cut in half at the abdomen with a heavy blade. This complete set of graded punishments was called the Wu Jing, the Five Pains. Li Su did not necessarily invent the five pains from scratch, but he institutionalized them. He turned them from ad hoc royal cruelty into predictable universal state policy. Every subject of Qin knew exactly which body part they would lose for which offense. That was the whole point. The law was to be as impersonal and terrifying as the movement of the seasons. Then, in 210 BC, Qin Shi Huang died on a road trip in the eastern provinces. The Chancellor Li Si was traveling with him, so was a court eunuch called Zhao Gao. And Zhao Gao, seeing an opportunity, persuaded Li Si to help him hide the emperor's death long enough to forge a decree that placed the emperor's youngest and most malleable son, Hu Hai, on the throne, as Qin II, rather than the older, more capable son who had been designated heir. Li Si agreed. It was the worst decision of his life. Within 2 years, Zhao Gao had turned the new young emperor into a puppet-isolated Li Si from the throne and manufactured charges of treason against him. Li Si was arrested in the interrogation cells of Shenyang Zhao Gao's men, beat him for weeks until he signed a confession admitting crimes he had not committed. He tried to send a letter to the emperor pleading his case. The letter was intercepted. His entire extended family, 3 degrees of relation, was rounded up and marked for execution alongside him. And then in the 7th month of the 2nd year of Qin Shilisi, was subjected to the full sequence of the 5 pains that he had helped standardize. He was tattooed on the face, his nose was cut off, his foot was amputated. He was castrated. And then, in the public marketplace of Shanyang, in front of a crowd of the citizens, whose laws he had written, he was cut in half at the waist. The historian Sima Qian, writing about a century later in the Shiji, records a heartbreaking detail. On the cart to the execution ground, as he was being dragged in chains, beside his second son Li Si, turned to the young man and said quietly, "I wish that you and I could once again lead our yellow dog out through the east gate of Shanghai to chase hares, but it can never be." Shanghai was Li Si's hometown, which he had left as an ambitious young clerk more than 40 years earlier to seek his fortune in the state of Qin. That single sentence about the yellow dog and the hares is one of the most quoted lines in all of Chinese literature, because it captures in one image the vanity of ambition and the price of political power. A man who once wielded life and death over 40 million subjects, wishing at the end that he had stayed home and gone rabbit hunting with his son. The Qin dynasty itself only outlived Li Si by 3 years. Zhao Gao, having devoured the chancellor, went on to devour the young emperor, and was in turn devoured by another prince, and the whole system Li Si had built collapsed in flames and rebellion by 206 BC. The Han dynasty that replaced it kept most of the Qin's administrative innovations, but softened the 5 pains, replacing physical mutilations with heavy labor and beatings under Emperor Wen. Li Si's execution is the perfect ancient case study of a machine turning on its maker. He did not just invent a punishment. He invented a legal universe in which no one, not even the chancellor, was above the mutilating knife. And when Zhao Gao pointed that universe at Li Si, the universe worked exactly the way Li Si had designed it to work. This is what makes it number 7, rather than lower on our countdown, because, as brutal as it was, at least it was over in a few hours. Some of the entries ahead of it took days or weeks, and were engineered deliberately to prolong the suffering as long as human physiology would allow. Number 6. The Ash Chamber of Persia. Somewhere in the heart of the Achaemenid Empire around 423 BC, a tower is being built. It is not a tower for observation, or worship, or for the housing of a granary. It is a tower for one purpose only. It is filled to a great depth with ash, fine gray wood ash, from thousands of fires powdered so lightly that any movement will send it billowing into the air. High above the ash, there is a small platform, a hatch, a rope, and down into the ash, the condemned man is dropped, alive, and left to fight the ash itself. The story comes to us from Ctesias of Crinidus, a Greek physician who lived in the Persian court in the late 5th century BC and wrote a 23-volume history of Persia called the Persica. Ctesias is not always a reliable narrator. Greek writers love to portray the Persians as decadent, cruel, and creative in their tortures, because it made their own Athenian civility look good by contrast. Modern historians take his stories with a large sprinkle of salt, but the story of the ash chamber is repeated in the Roman writer Valerius Maximus and, most tellingly, in the second book of Maccabees in the Bible, which describes a Jewish high priest called Menelaus being executed by exactly this method in 162 BC. 3 separate sources, spread over 500 years, in 3 different literary traditions, all describing the same weird, specific execution. Even if Ctesias exaggerated the details, something like this seems to have happened. Here's how it worked in Ctesias' telling. The first known victim, appropriately enough, was a king. His name was Sogdianus, sometimes called Secundianus, and he was one of at least 3 illegitimate sons of the Persian king Artaxerxes I, who claimed the throne after their father's death in 424 BC. Sogdianus murdered his half-brother Xerxes II, ruled for about 6 months, and was in turn overthrown by yet another half-brother, Ochus, who would become Darius II. Ochus did not want to be seen as an oath-breaker. He had sworn on solemn Persian oaths that Sogdianus would not die by the sword, would not die by poison, and would not die by starvation. Every classical form of royal execution was closed off, so Ochus's advisors invented a new one. A tower filled with fine ash, Sogdianus was lowered into it, and there is a horrible twist to the mechanism. CTES records that the ash was not left still. Wheels or paddles at the top of the tower were kept in motion so that a constant fine cloud of ash whirled around inside the chamber. Every breath the condemned man took drew gray powder into his lungs. Every step he took, every attempt to climb out only stirred up more of the choking dust. He did not die by the sword. He did not die by poison. He did not die by starvation. He suffocated on the very air around him. He drowned, in a manner of speaking, in nothing. There was food available. Ochus, keeping to his oath, in the most legalistic way possible, may even have had some toss down. Sogdianus did not die of hunger. He died of the interior slow accumulation of ash in his throat, his airways, his lungs. The most horrifying thing about the ash chamber is what it reveals about the ancient royal mind. Ochus took his sacred oath and treated it like a puzzle to be solved. He needed to keep his word and eliminate his rival at the same time. So he sat down with his court engineers, and together they designed a mechanism where the condemned man's own struggle for life became the machine that killed him. Every gasp for breath was a gasp of the killing powder. Every attempt to escape the ash pushed more ash up into the air. It was, in a purely engineering sense, elegant. Ochus reportedly used it again on his own full brother Arsites and on the rebel general Artiphilus. His wife, the ruthless Persian queen Arisadis, is said to have been particularly fond of ordering the punishment. In 162 BC, long after the Achaemenids had fallen, the Seleucid regent Lysias condemned the corrupt Jewish high priest Menelaus to the same fate at a place called Berea in modern Syria, at a tower said to be 50 cubits high, roughly 22 meters, filled with ash. The account in 2 Maccabees, chapter 13, records that Menelaus' body was not permitted burial. The author regarded it as divine justice. Modern archaeologists have never found the physical remains of a Persian ash chamber, That is not surprising. Fine wood ash does not survive well in the archaeological record, and towers are easy to demolish and repurpose. But every so often, on excavations in ancient Persian sites, digging teams uncover small towers of uncertain function, and it is impossible not to wonder what makes this number 6 on our list is not just the horror of the death, but the fact that the whole design of the chamber weaponizes the survival instinct. The victim's own body kills him. His diaphragm, his lungs, his desperate scramble to climb all of it, drives the ash deeper into him. There is no way to survive by holding still, and no way to survive by fighting. It is a machine that eats hope for breakfast, and it will be a long time in the history of executions before human beings design anything as psychologically vicious as that again. Number 5, Poena Cullei, the Roman punishment of the sack. The Tiber River in Rome flowed brown and slow past the temples and warehouses of the Republic, and in it, over the centuries, the state disposed of a very specific kind of criminal in a very specific kind of container. Roman law had a category of offense considered so unnatural, so cosmically polluting, that no ordinary execution could address it. That offense was parricidium, the killing of a father, mother, or close blood relative, and the punishment for it was called Poena Cullei, the penalty of the sack. Let us walk through it as a Roman would have understood it, because the horror of Poena Cullei lies not just in what happens, but in what it means. The convicted parricide is first stripped naked and beaten with special red-stained rods dyed the color of blood. His head is covered with the skin of a wolf. His feet are shoved into wooden clogs. This is not decoration. Each of these elements says the same thing. You have become something less than human. You are a beast dressed as a man. Then, in front of the crowd, the executioners bring out a large leather sack. The sack is called a culleus. It is the same kind of sack that Roman traders used to carry wine. Into that sack, alongside the naked, half-beaten prisoner, they push a live rooster, a live dog, a live monkey, and, most famously, a live viper. The mouth of the sack is sewn shut around the human being and the 4 animals. The sack is loaded onto a wooden cart. The cart is drawn by a team of black oxen through the city to the bank of the Tiber, or, in coastal towns, to the sea. And there, without ceremony, the sack is heaved overboard. Inside, in the last minutes before drowning, the prisoner shares the darkness with 4 terrified animals. The dog bites at anything it can reach. The rooster claws blindly. The monkey climbs and shrieks. The viper strikes at the nearest warm body. The prisoner drowns while being torn, bitten, pecked, and envenomed. It is theater and theology fused into a single leather container. Each of the animals has meaning in the Roman symbolic imagination. The dog represents mad rage. The rooster, which Roman poultry breeders considered a bird that will attack its own father, represents ungrateful arrogance. The monkey represents a caricature of humanity, a mockery of the man shape without a man's soul. The viper represents malice, poison, betrayal at the deepest level. Together with the parricide, they add up to a full portrait of the crime. And the disposal by water is a theological statement in itself. A parricide has broken the natural order so severely that the earth will not accept his body. His corpse cannot be permitted to touch the soil, or the earth will be polluted. He cannot be permitted to breathe the air, or the air will be polluted. He cannot be burned, because the fire will be polluted. He must be sealed away from all 4 elements, at once cast into flowing water inside a leather membrane and delivered downstream, out of Rome, out of the sight of gods, out of the natural world. He becomes, in effect, cosmic garbage. The earliest recorded case of the punishment of the sack comes from around 101 BC. The Roman historian Livy, in a passage preserved in later summaries, mentions a certain Publicus Malleolus who killed his own mother and was the first to be sewn into a leather sack and thrown into the sea. Interestingly, in Livy's account, there is no mention of animals. The animals seem to have been added gradually. First, just a viper, then a rooster, then the full menagerie, until by the reign of the Emperor Hadrian in the 100s AD, the classic combination of dog, rooster, monkey, and viper was legally standard. The jurist, Modestinus, writing in the 200s AD, quotes the formal legal formula. The culprit shall be beaten with rods, stained with his blood, and then shall be sewed up in a sack with a dog, a cock, a viper, and an ape, and the bag cast into the depth of the sea. Some modern historians think it may have been more legal theater than a routine practice. The logistics of stuffing a screaming man, a struggling dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster into a leather bag are appalling. Roman texts even suggest that in practice, courts often substituted damnatio ad bestias, throwing the parasite to the beasts in the arena when a suitable body of water was too far away. But Poena Cullei never really died. Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, revived it in the 300s AD, though he simplified the formula to just snakes. In the 500s AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I restored the full four-animal version in his legal codes. It remained the statutory penalty for parricide across the Byzantine Empire until around 892 AD, when it was finally replaced by burning at the stake. Even in the 1200s, the Castilian king Alfonso X revived the form of it in his Siete Partidas legal code in Spain. And there is a bizarre postscript. When the South Sea bubble collapsed in 1720s Britain, ruining thousands of investors, one furious member of Parliament actually stood up in the House of Commons and demanded that the directors of the South Sea Company be sewn into sacks with a dog, a cock, a viper, and an ape, and sunk in the River Thames. He was quoting Roman law, more than 1,500 years after Publicius Malleolus, to demand a punishment that even the Romans had come to regard as folklore. That is the reach of Poena Cullei. That is number 5. A leather sack, a portable hell, a portable universe of pollution dropped into a river without ceremony, and floated out to sea. Number 4. The live burial of the Vestal Virgins. In the heart of ancient Rome, along the sacred way, there stood a round temple containing a fire that was never allowed to go out. The fire was the sacred flame of the goddess Vesta. It was tended day and night, in shifts, by 6 of the most privileged women in Rome, the Vestal Virgins. They were chosen as children aged between 6 and 10 from Rome's leading families. They served for a minimum of 30 years. They enjoyed rights and privileges granted to no other Roman women. They controlled their own property. They could give evidence in court without swearing an oath. They rode in their own carriages through the streets. They had reserved seats at the games. They had the power to pardon condemned prisoners simply by touching them on the way to execution. If a consul met a Vestal on the road, the consul stepped aside. In return, they had to keep 3 things intact: the sacred flame, the secrets of the goddess, and their virginity. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the offense was called incestum, and it was believed to imperil the entire Roman state. The gods, so the Romans believed, would turn against Rome if a Vestal's body was defiled. Plagues, defeats in war, earthquakes, and lightning strikes were all interpreted at various points in history as evidence that a Vestal must have been unchaste, and under Roman religious law, a Vestal could not be executed by ordinary means. Her body was consecrated, her blood could not be spilled. To strike her, to cut her, to strangle her, or to poison her would itself be an act of sacrilege. But Roman law also required that a Vestal found guilty of incestum must die. So the Romans, being Romans, invented a legal loophole. If they could not kill her, they could put her somewhere she would die by herself. It was called the Campus Sceleratus, the field of wickedness, a rising piece of ground just inside the Colline Gate at the edge of the ancient Servian walls. There, hollowed out below the surface, was a small underground chamber. Inside the chamber, before the ceremony, they placed a couch, a lit lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a jug of milk. Enough provisions, in the strict legal sense that the Vestal could be said to have entered a room stocked to keep her alive. She would not technically be executed. Rome would not technically be killing her. She would descend into an underground room with her rations, and if she happened to die there, that was a matter between her and the gods. On the day of her condemnation, the ceremony began at the house of the Vestals in the Forum, the chief pontiff of Rome. The Pontifex Maximus formally stripped her of her sacred woolen headband, her white robes, her insignia of office. She was dressed like a corpse in the plain white shroud of a funeral. Then, in complete silence, she was placed on a covered litter and carried through the streets of Rome, accompanied by her weeping family, as though she were already dead. This was the point. She had to be treated as dead by the community before she went into the ground, because to treat her as living would be to admit that the community was killing her. At the campus Sceleratus, near the Colline Gate, a ladder was placed into the mouth of the underground chamber. The Vestal was untied and helped to her feet. The Pontifex Maximus said a prayer with his eyes cast down and his hands raised toward heaven, not looking at her. Then the Vestal, on her own 2 feet, climbed down the ladder into the room below the earth. The ladder was withdrawn. The stone lid was slid into place. The mouth of the chamber was heaped with earth. The field of wickedness was leveled again, and the crowds went home. Down in the chamber, alone with her single lamp, and her single loaf of bread, and her single jug of water, the Vestal Virgin did what every young woman does with a few days of life left in the dark. Some may have eaten and drunk and stretched their agony out for a week. Others may have refused the food, put out the lamp, and died in a few days from dehydration. Others may have taken their own lives in ways the sources do not specify. The Romans never made the mechanics of it public, precisely because the whole legal fiction depended on not looking too closely. The historian Livy records a case as early as 483 BC involving a Vestal called Oppia. Another case in 216 BC, during the panic after the disastrous defeat at Cannae in the Second Punic War, saw 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, condemned. One was buried alive. The other took her own life before the ceremony could be completed. The most famous case comes from AD 91, in the reign of the Emperor Domitian, who was determined to revive old moral traditions. The chief Vestal, Cornelia, was accused, tried in absentia, and condemned to the ancient punishment. The Roman writer Pliny the Younger, in a horrified letter, describes her descent into the chamber. As she stepped down onto the ladder, her long robe caught. The executioner, forbidden to touch her, reached out a hand to steady her. Cornelia recoiled from him and, according to Pliny, snapped, "Why are you touching me? Am I not still pure? Caesar thinks me unchaste. Me, who performed the sacraments under which he won, he triumphed." Then she descended on her own into the earth. Modern archaeologists have never conclusively identified the underground chambers of the Campus Sceleratus. The land was reused, built over, forgotten. The lamps, the loaves, the jugs of milk, if they were ever real, are dust. But the punishment tells us something important about the ancient Roman legal imagination. When a religious system requires a death but forbids a killing, it invents a room. That is number 4. Not the cruelest by pure pain, but perhaps the most philosophically monstrous. A society that could not bear to say it was executing a woman, but could bear to bury her alive in a hole with a loaf of bread, and pretend she was still legally alive when the earth closed over her. Number 3, Damnatio Ad Bestias, the fatal charades of Rome. Every schoolchild has heard the phrase "thrown to the lions." What almost no one understands is what that phrase actually described in the Roman arena. The Latin term is damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, and by the reign of the emperors Titus and Domitian in the late 1st century AD, it had evolved into something that has no modern parallel. It was not just execution. It was live-action mythology performed with condemned prisoners in the leading roles. The classical scholar Kathleen Coleman, in a famous 1990 study called Fatal Charades, coined the phrase that historians still use for it. Because what the Romans were staging in the Colosseum on the midday program of the games was not simply killings, it was theater in which the condemned man played the part of a mythological figure and was killed exactly as the myth said that figure had died. The Roman poet Martial, writing around AD 80 during the inaugural games of the Colosseum built by the emperors Vespasian and Titus, published a small book of poems called the Liber Spectacularum, the Book of Spectacles. In it, in short, sharp, almost admiring epigrams, he reviewed some of the executions like a modern theater critic would review a play. In one epigram, Martial describes a condemned man dressed as Orpheus, the mythical Greek musician who charmed animals with his lyre. In the myth, Orpheus is eventually torn apart by wild women, or, in some versions, by animals. In the Colosseum, the condemned man was pushed into the arena with a lyre dressed in Orpheus's tunic, surrounded by tame animals, and, at a signal, a trained bear was released into the arena. The bear, per Martial, ripped apart the singer. Real death, real body, fake myth. Real applause. In another epigram, Martial describes a bandit called Laureolus who was crucified in the arena, and then, while he is still hanging on the cross, eagles and a bear are released to consume him. This is not mercy. This is enhancement. The audience is watching a criminal die on the cross the way Jesus of Nazareth died, but with animals added for spectacle. There are references to a condemned man forced to play Icarus, the mythological figure who flew too close to the sun and fell to his death. He was dressed in wax and feather wings hoisted into the air by some kind of stage machinery and then dropped from a height into the arena, where his fall was fatal, or if he survived, animals finished him off. There are references to a condemned man playing Prometheus the Titan who was chained to a rock while an eagle ate his liver every day. The condemned Prometheus was chained to a wooden frame in the arena while a bear or a boar was set upon his exposed torso, opening him up for the crowd. There is, most horrifyingly, an epigram about a woman condemned to reenact the myth of Pasiphae, the queen of Crete who, according to legend, was cursed to mate with a bull and give birth to the Minotaur. The condemned woman in the Roman arena was staged with a specially prepared bull. Even Martial, always eager to flatter the emperor's spectacles, allows a note of astonishment into his review. The staging of these executions required an entire specialized workforce. There were prop makers who built the mythological costumes. There were animal handlers, the bestiari, who prepared the leopards, lions, bears, and boars. There were cage engineers who designed the lifts and trapdoors of the Colosseum's underground hypogeum so that a fully staged mythological scene could rise up through the arena floor in front of 50,000 spectators. Executions were held at midday, between the morning venations, the beast hunts, and the afternoon gladiatorial combats. The midday shows were considered so unpleasant that many upper-class Romans took their lunch break during them. The philosopher Seneca, writing to a friend, in the 1st century AD, describes wandering into the arena at midday expecting light entertainment and being appalled by what he saw. In the morning, they throw men to the lions and bears, he wrote. At noon, they throw them to the spectators themselves. It was, in his view, a moral corruption of the audience even worse than of the victims. What is left of Damnatio Ad Bestias is scattered across the imperial archaeology of the Roman world. In the North African city of Zlatan, in modern-day Libya, a mosaic from around AD 200 shows in horrifying detail a series of condemned men being goaded by bestiari toward hungry leopards, their arms bound behind them, their faces already turned away in resignation. In the amphitheaters of Pompeii, Roman Gaul, Roman Britain, and Roman Spain, similar staged executions took place, though rarely as elaborately as in Rome itself. Cicero, the great Roman orator and moralist, records his own disgust at a case in which a man was thrown to the beasts simply because he was considered physically ugly. Cicero regarded it as a moral outrage. The audience regarded it as entertainment. What makes Damnatio Ad Bestias number 3 on our list is the sheer combination of ingredients. It is not just an execution. It is a public execution. It is a public execution disguised as art. It is a public execution disguised as art in which the audience is invited to enjoy the death as a fulfillment of a familiar story. It psychologically prepares the audience to feel that they have been culturally elevated by watching a person be torn apart. Rome did not just kill you. Rome cast you in a play. Rome dressed you as a hero from a myth, promised you a role in the greatest theater on earth, and then made sure that when the animals were released, you played your part all the way to the end. Number 2. Scaphism, the boats of Persia, somewhere in the interior of the Persian Empire, around 401 BC. A Persian soldier called Mithridates lies naked on his back inside a small wooden boat. The boat is only just long enough to contain his body. A second boat, identical to the first, is placed on top of him, upside down, so that the two together form an enclosed shell around him like a clamshell. But there are 5 holes cut carefully into the shell, 1 for his head, 2 for his hands, 2 for his feet. So his head, arms, and legs stick out into the open air, while the rest of his body is sealed inside the darkness of the wooden coffin. Now, his executioners walk over to him. They open his mouth, and they begin pouring in a mixture. Milk and honey, over and over, until he cannot swallow another mouthful. Then they smear the same mixture over his face, his arms, his legs. Then they carry the boat, with him inside it, and float it out onto the surface of a stagnant, sun-warmed pond. And there they leave him. The sun comes up. Flies find the honey on his face. Then they find his mouth, his nostrils, his ears. The milk and honey he has been forced to drink begins to do its work in his intestines. He develops uncontrollable diarrhea. Because he is sealed inside the wooden shell, the diarrhea has nowhere to go. It stays with him in the boat. Maggots hatch inside the shell, inside his body. Every day the executioners come back, they open his mouth again and pour in more milk and honey. He is not permitted to die of hunger. He is not permitted to die of thirst. His face is turned so that the sun is always in his eyes. His skin blisters and cracks. The insects deepen. According to Plutarch of Chaeronea, the Greek philosopher and historian, writing about 500 years after the event in his Life of Artaxerxes, Mithridates survived in the boat for 17 days. Then, in Plutarch's chilling phrase, when they finally opened the upper boat, they found his flesh devoured and swarms of noisome creatures preying upon and, as it were, growing to his inwards. Plutarch's source for the story was Ctesias of Crenides, the same Greek physician who gave us the ash chamber. Modern historians, once again, treat Ctesias with caution. He may have exaggerated, he may have invented, he may have adapted an older folk tale. There is no Persian source that confirms Scaphism was ever a routine punishment. There are no archaeological remains, no execution boats preserved. But the story once told has never let go of the Western imagination because it is such a beautifully engineered nightmare. Every element of Scaphism is designed for the maximum extension of suffering. The wooden shell contains the excrement so that the victim marinates in his own filth. The honey attracts insects. The forced feeding prevents death by hunger. The stagnant pond, warm in the sun, provides ideal breeding conditions for maggots and mosquitoes. The daily inspection ensures that the victim is not allowed to die too soon, and the crime that got Mithridates put in the boats is the horrifying human detail that makes the story unforgettable. Mithridates was not a traitor. Mithridates was not a rebel. Mithridates had, in a way, saved the empire. Here's what happened. In 401 BC, a Persian prince called Cyrus the Younger revolted against his elder brother King Artaxerxes II and marched an army eastward to seize the throne. The two armies met at a place called Cunaxa, near modern Baghdad. In the middle of the battle, in the melee, Cyrus was killed. According to Plutarch's account, drawing on Ctesias, the man who actually delivered the fatal wound was Mithridates, a young Persian soldier. The king was grateful because Cyrus's death ended the rebellion in an afternoon. But the king also wanted the credit for killing his own brother, personally. He wanted to be able to tell the empire that he, Artaxerxes, had struck down the traitor with his own sword. So he told Mithridates, "Keep quiet, take your reward, and let me have the glory." Mithridates agreed. Sometime later, at a royal banquet, Mithridates got drunk. He began boasting to the other soldiers about the day he had killed Cyrus the Younger with his own hand. He described the wound. He described the arrow. He described the moment. He said too much. Word got back to the king. Artaxerxes did not appreciate the correction. He sentenced Mithridates to death in the boats. He specified that the execution should be slow. Mithridates was punished. In other words, not for a crime, but for a piece of drunken tavern boasting that damaged the king's public relations. Every day of the 17 days he lay in the boats, every insect crawling on him, every mouthful of milk and honey forced past his teeth, was the price of a moment of drunken vanity. And the king could sit on his throne 200 kilometers away and reassure his court that he was, in fact, the one who had killed Cyrus the Younger, because the only witness to the contrary was slowly disappearing into a wooden shell full of flies. According to Plutarch, Darius II used a version of the same punishment on his brother Arsaces. In 162 BC, long after the Achaemenids had fallen, some sources say a version was applied to the high priest Menelaus at Berea, though other sources have him executed in the ash chamber. Different traditions describe the boats differently. In some versions, the vessels are hollowed-out tree trunks rather than boats. In some, honey is smeared not on the face, but only on the exposed limbs. All versions agree on the essential horror. The victim is contained. The victim is fed. The victim is not allowed to die quickly. The insects do most of the work, and the executioners simply top up the milk and honey. The word scaphism itself comes from the Greek scaph, meaning boat or trough. That is number 2 on our countdown. It is not the fastest. It is not the loudest. It is not the most theatrical. It is simply, quietly, engineered to last as long as a human body can be kept alive while being eaten by insects and drowned in its own filth in the sunshine. There is only one execution method in the ancient world that outperforms it in reputation, and only just, and we are about to reach it. Number 1, the Brazen Bull of Phalaris. The city of Acragas, on the southern coast of Sicily, was in the 6th century BC, one of the wealthiest cities in the Greek world. Its temples still stand, some of the finest surviving examples of ancient Greek architecture along a ridge that tourists today call the Valley of the Temples. Around 570 BC, the city fell under the rule of a tyrant called Phalaris. His reign lasted only about 16 years, but in that time his name became so notorious that 2,500 years later, historians still argue about how much of the horror was true. He is said in some sources to have eaten suckling babies. He is said to have tortured his enemies for entertainment. He is said, above all, to have owned a specific object, a device unique in the history of execution that no one had ever seen before or since. A hollow bronze bull, life-sized, standing on 4 bronze hooves with a door built into one flank, and here is where the story becomes both legend and somehow believable at the same time. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, and drawing on much earlier sources, the bull was designed and built by a bronze worker named Perillus of Athens, sometimes spelled Perillus. Perillus came to Sicily seeking royal patronage. He had heard of the tyrant Phalaris's reputation for savagery, and he had an idea he thought would delight the tyrant. He presented himself at court and unveiled his creation. A full-size, hollow bronze bull, beautifully cast, its surface polished to a mirror finish, its horns curved and menacing. At first, Phalaris was reportedly delighted by the sculpture itself. He offered Perillus presents and gave orders that the bull be dedicated to the gods. Then Perillus explained what the bull was actually for. There is a door, he said, cut into the flank of the bull. Inside, the bull is hollow. You place a condemned prisoner inside. You close and lock the door. You build a fire underneath the bronze belly of the bull. The bronze conducts the heat. The bronze holds the heat. The prisoner does not burn quickly. He roasts. And here, Perillus pointed with special pride to the head of the bull, is my true invention. Inside the bull's throat, I have installed a series of pipes and vents, an acoustic system, that transforms the screams of the roasting prisoner into sounds that, when they emerge from the bull's mouth and nostrils, resemble not human cries at all, but the deep throaty bellowing of a real bull. So you will hear a bull's roar. You will not hear a man's voice. The suffering will be reformatted into music, and Diodorus Siculus records that Phalaris, hardened tyrant that he was appalled by the invention. Not by the roasting, not by the fire, not by the door, but by the acoustic pipes in the throat, by the beautiful engineered cruelty of turning a man's dying screams into art. Phalaris, in that moment, made a decision. He would test the acoustics. He turned to Paralaus and said, in effect, show me. Get inside. Demonstrate the sound. Perilius, flattered and eager to be seen as the master of his invention, climbed into the belly of the bull. Phalaris ordered the door slammed and locked from the outside. Then he ordered a fire lit underneath, and there, in front of the tyrant and his court, Perillus of Athens became the first man to die inside the brazen bull he had built. He heard, in the last seconds of his own life, the exact sound he had designed his own screams turning into the bellow of a bronze animal. According to some versions of the story, Phalaris ordered the door reopened before Perillus actually died, dragged the badly burned inventor out, took one look at him, and then had him thrown from a cliff, unwilling to let him die inside the beautiful device he had polluted with his loathsome intentions. Other versions say he was left inside to finish. Either way, the first man to test the brazen bull was the man who invented it. And that would be enough to make the brazen bull one of the most famous execution devices in history all by itself. But the story does not end there. Phalaris kept the bull. He used it, according to ancient sources, on political enemies, on prisoners of war, on anyone who displeased him, throughout the rest of his reign. The bellowing of the bronze bull became a signature sound of Acragas under Phalaris. Then, around 554 billion C, after roughly 16 years of tyranny, the people of Acragas revolted. They were led by an aristocrat named Telemachus, who was the ancestor of the later, more benign tyrant Theron. Phalaris was overthrown. And here is what the tradition preserved in Diodorus and other later sources says happened next. The people of Acragas, having captured their tyrant, dragged him to the place where the brazen bull stood. They opened the door, they pushed him inside, they lit the fire. And they listened as the machine that Phalaris had commissioned, the machine his own inventor had died inside, roasted the tyrant to death, and turned his screams into the bellowing of a bronze animal. The bull executed both its designer and its owner. The patent killed the patent holder. There is no other execution device in the ancient world with a story arc that clean. It is almost too neat to be true, and modern historians correctly point out that no physical remains of the brazen bull have ever been found. No Greek archaeological site has produced fragments of a hollow bronze bull with an acoustic pipe in its throat. Ancient bronze was extremely valuable and, if the bull existed, would probably have been melted down long ago for coinage or armor. Some scholars think the whole thing was a Sicilian folktale invented after the fact to blacken the memory of Phalaris. Others think a real bronze bull sculpture did exist, and the story of its use grew in the retelling. There is one further tantalizing detail. Diodorus records that when the Carthaginians sacked Acragas in 406 BC, more than a century after Phalaris, they carried off a bronze bull as loot back to their capital city. And when the Romans in turn destroyed Carthage in the Third Punic War in 146 billion, the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus reportedly found the bull in the wreckage and returned it to the descendants of the people of Acragas. Whether that bull was the original Phalaris bull, a later copy, or an entirely unrelated bronze sculpture that had been given the same story to fit the legend, no one can say. There is no bull in any Sicilian museum today, but the shape of the legend is the deep truth. Perillus designed a machine to please a tyrant by weaponizing his own creativity, and the tyrant killed him inside it before he even finished his sales pitch. Then the people, when they finally rose up against the tyrant, used his own machine to end him. The brazen bull sits at number 1 on this list, not because it caused more pain than Scaphism, or lasted longer than the Vestal Virgins' underground chamber, or killed more people than Damnatio Ad Bestias. It sits at number 1 because it is the perfect story of an execution method turning back upon its makers twice in a single generation. The inventor killed, the owner killed, the instrument still ringing. A bronze bull that ate the ancient world's imagination and never let go, because it is the closest thing history has ever produced to a machine that punished the man who dreamed it up. Perillus of Athens got exactly what he asked for. He wanted to be remembered, he wanted to be famous, he wanted a permanent place in the imagination of the ancient world for having invented a device of pure engineered cruelty. And he did. Every single one of us knows his name. 2,600 years later, he got exactly the immortality he asked for. He just did not survive it. Every one of these 10 methods began the same way. Someone somewhere sat down and thought carefully about how to inflict as much pain and terror as possible on another human being. Every one of them was defended, at the time, as necessary. Every one of them, in the end, was abolished, replaced, or quietly forgotten because even the societies that invented them could not, in the end, live with them. The Tunica Molesta turned into sympathy for its victims. Execution by elephant faded away in the 1800s as even the elephants began to refuse. Apotympanismos was quietly buried by the same democracy that used it. The 5 panes of Chin were softened by the Han. The ash chamber has left no ruins. Poena Cullei was replaced by burning. The Vestal Virgins ceased to exist when Christianity closed the temple in the 4th century AD. Damnatio Ad Bestias was banned by the Emperor Honorius in the 400s AD. Scaphism, if it ever really existed, is remembered only in one paragraph of one Greek biographer. And the Brazen Bull, if it ever really existed, was melted down for coins somewhere in a Sicilian or Carthaginian mint centuries ago. History is, in one sense, the slow abandonment of these devices. Every generation invents new cruelties and eventually renounces them. Not always fast enough, not always completely, but the pattern is there. The one shared feature of every entry on this list is that the men who invented them thought they were building something that would last. Perillus thought his bull would ring for centuries. Li Si thought his 5 panes would keep the Qin dynasty eternal. Nero thought his garden lanterns would frighten the Christians into obedience. All of them were wrong. The victims outlasted them. The empires that used them collapsed. The one thing that survived, and the reason you and I are here right now, is the memory. If you have made it this far, hit that like button so this history reaches more people. Subscribe if you want more countdowns like this. 1. Because I have already begun researching a companion video that answers the natural next question. What happened when kings and emperors themselves ended up on the execution block? And what methods did the people who overthrew them choose to make an example of a fallen ruler? Some of those answers will shock you. That video is coming next. Drop a comment and tell me, out of these 10 methods, which one you had never heard of before, and which one you think should have been number 1 instead of the Brazen Bull. History is only as loud as the people who keep telling it. Thank you for being one of them. See you in the next video.